March 9th, 1974. Lubang Island, the Philippines. An old major climbs a jungle hillside, wearing a uniform he hasn't worn in 30 years. Waiting for him at the top is a Japanese officer, rifle in hand, sword at his side, uniform patched and repatched, hanging on a frame kept alive by coconut milk and stolen rice. The major unfolds a piece of paper and reads out a military order. And the officer begins to cry. Because on that day, Second Lieutenant Hiroo Onoda finally learns that World War II ended 29 years earlier. He simply never got the message. This is his story.
Over the next 15 minutes, you'll hear how one man kept fighting the Second World War for 3 decades after it ended. How he dismissed Japan's surrender as enemy propaganda. How he watched his 3 companions leave him one by surrender and by death. How he ignored letters, photographs, even recordings of his own family, convinced it was all a trap. And how a young hippie adventurer finally did what the world's greatest militaries could not. He found the last soldier, and still couldn't bring him home. This is Echoes of War. Stay with me.
To understand this story, you have to understand the man. Hiroo Onoda was born on March 19th, 1922, in the mountains of Wakayama, Japan. As a young man, he wasn't a fanatic. He was a businessman, working for a Japanese trading company in occupied China. He danced, he played cards, he had a girlfriend. An ordinary young man. Then, in 1942, at 20 years old, he was drafted into the Imperial Japanese Army. And the Army saw something in him. He was selected for the Nakano School, the Empire's elite intelligence academy. There, he wasn't trained to charge machine guns. He was trained in the dark arts of guerrilla warfare. Sabotage, espionage, survival behind enemy lines. And above all, he was trained in one idea, drilled so deep it would outlive the Empire itself. A Japanese soldier never surrenders. Never. By December 1944, the war was already lost, though no one in Tokyo would say it out loud. Onoda, now a second lieutenant, received his final posting, a small island in the Philippines called Lubang. His orders were simple: destroy the airstrip and the pier, slow the American advance at any cost, and under no circumstances, ever, surrender or take his own life. His commander made him a promise. Relief would come. It might take 3 years, it might take 5, but the army would come back for him. Remember that promise. It explains everything that follows.
December 26th, 1944. Onoda lands on Lubang with a handful of men. He wants to blow up the airstrip immediately, but senior officers on the island outrank him and refuse. It's a fatal mistake, because on February 28th, 1945, the Americans come. Naval bombardment, then landing craft. Lubang's garrison fights the old way, in the open, and dies the old way. In days, the island falls. But Onoda does what he was trained to do. He vanishes. Along with 3 soldiers, Private Yuichi Akatsu, Corporal Shoichi Shimada, and Private First Class Kinshichi Kozuka, he melts into the mountains and begins the guerrilla war he was sent to fight. They raid farms for rice. They steal cattle. They fire on patrols. Months pass. Then, on August 15th, 1945, the world changes. Emperor Hirohito's voice crackles over the airwaves, and ordinary Japanese people hear their god emperor speak for the first time. Japan, he says, has accepted surrender. On Lubang, the announcement means nothing. The 4 men in the mountains have no radio. And here's the crucial detail. Even when the news reaches them, it arrives in the worst possible way. American planes drop thousands of leaflets over the jungle. The war is over. Come down from the mountains. Signed with the name of a Japanese general. To you and me, that's an act of mercy. To a Nakano-trained intelligence officer, it's textbook enemy propaganda. And so, they make the decision that will cost 3 decades. The leaflets are fake. The
the war continues.
By 1946, the world has moved on. Cities are being rebuilt. Japan has a new constitution. And on Lubang, 4 men are still at war. They keep a military routine that would impress a drill sergeant. Exercises at dawn, intelligence notes on enemy movements, a strict hierarchy. Onoda still salutes. They treat their own wounds with jungle plants. They dry beef into strips that last months. They keep a calendar by the phases of the moon. But the years grind them down, one by one. In 1949, Private Akatsu can't take it anymore. He separates from the group, and months later surrenders to Filipino forces. For the remaining 3, Akatsu is now a traitor, proof that the outside world corrupts. And his surrender brings something worse, attention. Search parties comb the jungle. Planes drop newspapers showing a rebuilt Tokyo. Letters from their own families. Photographs of their mothers grown old. Recordings played from loudspeakers. And every single time, the 3 men hold counsel and reach the same verdict. Sophisticated forgery. These were intelligence officers, trained to assume everything was a trap. The trap was in their own heads. In 1953, a shootout with fishermen leaves Shimada with a bullet in his leg. He survives. But on May 7th, 1954, a patrol finds them by a riverbank, and Shimada is shot dead. Onoda and Kozuka bury their friend and dig in deeper.
2 men now, a lieutenant and a private, fighting an empire that no longer exists. They've convinced themselves of something extraordinary, that Japan would never truly surrender, that the emperor was preparing a final counterattack from Manchuria, that the leaflets, the letters, the photographs, all of it was one enormous psychological operation designed to flush them out. This is the part of the story where disbelief becomes something very close to faith. In 1959, a Japanese student expedition hacks through the jungle and actually finds their hidden hut. They leave gifts, letters, newspapers. By the time Onoda and Kozuka return, the visitors are gone. Another trick. Another test. And here is the thing you have to admit. From inside Onoda's mind, it was airtight. Every proof that the war was over arrived from the sky, from the enemy, or from strangers. Nothing ever arrived through the one channel that mattered, his chain of command. His orders said relief would come. His orders said never surrender. So until a superior officer stood in front of him and spoke those words, the war, by definition, was not over. It was madness. And it was perfectly logical. The 2 men settle into a rhythm measured in decades. They read the dropped newspapers as intelligence. They raid the island's farms. And nearly every year, they burn the farmers' rice harvest after threshing, as a signal to the empire they still serve. We are still here. Still fighting.
October 19th, 1972. Onoda and Kozuka raid a rice store at the edge of the forest. Local police respond. Gunfire. Kozuka falls, killed instantly, after 27 years in the jungle. Onoda escapes alone into the mountains. And this time, the world takes notice, because Kozuka's body proves something Japan had refused to believe. Soldiers from World War II are still out there. Newspapers splash the story across the planet. Tokyo sends search parties, hundreds of men, helicopters, loudspeakers, family members calling his name into the trees. Onoda watches it all from the brush and reaches the only conclusion his training allows. The enemy is trying harder than ever. He is now completely alone, 50 years old, fighting a war that ended 10,000 days ago. And then, in February 1974, something walks into his camp that no one could have predicted. Not a soldier, not a search party. A skinny 24-year-old Japanese hippie named Norio Suzuki, a college dropout backpacking around the world on a personal quest he described as find Lieutenant Onoda, see a wild panda, and discover the abominable snowman. In that order.
Suzuki has been on Lubang for 4 days when he finds him. Try to picture that moment. A bearded young wanderer sits down across a campfire from a man who believes it is still 1945. But Suzuki does something no search party ever tried. He doesn't argue. He doesn't recite facts. He listens. He stays with Onoda in the jungle. Days of conversation, shared meals, endless questions. And slowly, the old officer opens up. To this stranger, he finally says the thing he has never said out loud. He will surrender, but only to a superior officer with proper orders. Nothing less can release him from his duty. Suzuki flies back to Japan carrying photographs that stun the nation. The government hunts down the one man who can free Onoda, Major Yoshimi Taniguchi, the officer who once promised that relief would come, now retired, selling books for a living. And so, on March 9th, 1974, an aging major climbs a jungle hillside on Lubang in an old uniform, carrying the promise his army broke 30 years earlier. He reads the order. Japan has surrendered. All combat activity is to cease. Lieutenant, your duty is complete. Hiroo Onoda stands at attention and weeps.
The next day, Onoda walks out of the jungle in his patched uniform and formally surrenders at the island's radar base. He hands over his officer's sword, his mother's dagger, the one she gave him in 1944, in case capture left him no choice but to die. Several grenades, 500 rounds of ammunition, and a Type 99 rifle, still cleaned, still oiled, still perfectly functional after 29 years. In Manila, President Ferdinand Marcos holds a ceremony and grants him a full pardon. Because we have to be honest about what those decades cost. Over the years, Onoda's group killed around 30 islanders and wounded about 100. To the people of Lubang, he wasn't a legend. He was a dangerous ghost in the mountains. On March 12th, Onoda lands in Tokyo to a hero's welcome. Ticker tape, tears, a best-selling memoir, No Surrender, My 30-Year War. But the celebration hides something stranger. Onoda doesn't fit in this new Japan of neon and noise and abundance. A year later, he moves to Brazil and raises cattle in the interior. Later, he comes home to run a wilderness school for young Japanese, teaching them, in his words, how to be truly alive. And Norio Suzuki, the young man who found him, he went looking for the Yeti in the Himalayas and died there in an avalanche in 1986. Onoda mourned him like a brother.
Hiroo Onoda died on January 16, 2014, at 91. The last loyal ghost of a war that ended before most people watching this video were born. Was he a hero? A fool? A man betrayed twice. Once by an empire that ordered him never to surrender, and once by an army that forgot to come back for him? Here is the uncomfortable lesson. The war didn't end for Onoda when the treaties were signed. It ended the moment someone finally treated him as a soldier instead of a problem, and brought him his orders. If this story moved you, the next one is even harder to believe. The unit of 1,100 artists who fooled Hitler's army with inflatable tanks. Subscribe to Echoes of War so the next story finds you.